Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am back to do my wrap up for part 1 of October, all of the books that I read in the first half of this month. Do let me know what you think about this lighting situation. Obviously we are getting into the autumn winter months, the darker months, and I'm trying to make sure that I've got the best light possible. I'm really quite fortunate in that my overhead lights in my bedroom are almost like spotlights, so do let me know what you think about this, because this is the alternative with natural light, which is not terrible because I have quite big windows, but is maybe not the best thing ever. And this is what the light looks like when it's dark outside and I just have these on. I'd always prefer to use natural light as much as possible, especially during the daytime when I'm filming, but these are pretty good. And it means that I don't have to invest in lighting, at least until I move out. But anyway, into the books that I've read in the first half of October. So first off, I read Before the Coffee Gets Cold, Tales from the Cafe by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. This is a follow-up to the original collection Before the Coffee Gets Cold, which takes place in a cafe in Japan where the rumour is that at a particular seat with a particular coffee drink, you may be able to be transported backwards and forwards in time. However, there are specific rules that you must abide. Firstly, you can only time travel within the cafe and you must remain seated at that particular time travel seat the entire duration, or you will be transported back into the present. You can only meet up with people who you know have visited the cafe, which is why most people decide not to time travel into the future, because there is no guarantee that somebody would have ventured into the cafe. When you do choose to time travel, you'll be presented with a cup of coffee and you must drink that cup of coffee before it gets cold, otherwise you will be stuck forever. Though these two books are presented as novels, they really do kind of work like related short stories, and I would say that if you enjoyed this initial one, you will enjoy this one just as much. It is 4 news stories from 4 different perspectives, but it is much the same story. These books just give you a little glimpse into different people's lives and just remind you that everybody has some sort of heartbreaking story. It really makes you think about the amount of people that you meet every day and you just do not know anything about them. You do not know what their story is. You do not necessarily know what kind of losses they've endured, what successes they've had. You really cannot judge people from just first view. Next up, I read this little collection of Lord Byron poetry, partially inspired by Jennifer from Jennifer Brooks, and I know that Kieran from KD Books was kind of cheering on the fact that I was reading this because I know he really loves Lord Byron. If you've been watching my wrap-ups, you'll know that I read Percy Bysshe Shelley a few months ago, and this is just another dip for me into romantic poetry, and I really enjoyed this. It's interesting because I don't know really what I expected of Byron, but I wasn't quite expecting them to be so funny. I wasn't expecting Lord Byron to be quite so playful with his use of rhyme and meter, and quite so meta at some points and self-referential. These poems will be at some points beautiful and then other points absolutely hilarious. So for example, you'll have like a classic romantic poem like She Walks in Beauty. She walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace which waves in every raven tress or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days and goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. So, you know, something that is quite traditional and romantic, and then you'll have his epigrams on Castlereagh. Lord Castlereagh was quite a controversial political figure, and upon his death, Byron wrote, "Posterity will ne'er survey a nobler grave than this. Here lies the bones of Castlereagh, stop traveller, and the reason that I have paused is that they retracted the word." I just love how you will go from like beautiful romantic poetry to Byron telling you to piss on someone's grave. Great. And to my mother who is watching this, it doesn't count as swearing if it's quoting. One thing that it is worth pointing out is that Byron does like his long poems, and I know for myself that I do personally tend to prefer like shorter, sharper poems, but I think what does kind of save these for me is the fact that he is so playful. But I will say Byron is probably not going to be a poet for you if you need like sharp, short poems where every word is necessary and intentional, that every word needs to be crucial to whatever story the poet is trying to tell. Because Byron will kind of take you on a journey within his poems. You know, he'll wander over here and realise, oh, I'm kind of stuck in this verse for a little while. Well, let's just kind of lounge around here for a bit until this verse is over. And like I say, if you want every single word to be intentional and have very direct meaning, then maybe not for you. A beginning of a poem that I really quite enjoyed was the epistle from Dr. Murray to Dr. Polidori. "Dear Doctor, I have read your play," which is a good one in its way, "purges the eyes and moves the bowels, and drenches handkerchiefs like towels, with tears that in a flux of grief afford hysterical magical relief to shattered nerves and quickened pulses, which your catastrophe convulses. I like your moral and machinery. Your plot, too, has such scope for scenery. Your dialogue is apt and smart, the play's concoction full of art. Your hero raves, your heroine cries, all stab and everybody dies. In short, your tragedy would be the very thing to hear and see. And then it continues, and I just think it's great. So now that I have appeased Kieran by praising Lord Byron, maybe he might forgive me for not 100% loving Burnt Sugar? So, Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi. This has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize this year, and I have heard nothing but fantastic things about it. This book tells the story of a woman who has a really poor relationship with her mother. However, as she is getting older, is really coming to struggle with the fact that her mother, who she sees as having inflicted so much cruelty on her as a child, is now coming to be more dependent on her as her body and her mind start to fail. She's really going through this grieving process for her mother, who is still alive and who she has all of these conflicting feelings about. And I will say, the beginning of this book is absolutely spectacular. I thought I was going to love this book after reading like the first chapter or so. I was underlining things everywhere, which is not something I tend to do. I was like dog-earing pages that I really enjoyed. And then I don't really know what happened, but after like the second chapter or so, this just kind of lost me and I just couldn't get into it at all. It just started to get a little bit meandering for my personal taste and enjoyment, and also I was talking to Kieran about this. I feel like I appreciated this book more than enjoyed it, and I think a large part of that is because the main character of this, her brain is just so exhausting to be inside for more than about 30 pages. Which is kind of the point, like she is definitely a deliberately dislikable character, but sometimes you're just like, oh. And I feel like this is a classic case of how literary fiction will often really push the boundaries of what I tend to think that I like in fiction. So for example, I always say that I don't really mind if a book is particularly plotless as long as the character development is really strong. I don't tend to mind slow-paced books. However, this for me was like too slow-paced with not much plot happening. It was too character-focused to the point where I was just like, what's the point here? There just didn't seem to be much drive and momentum in this for my personal enjoyment, unfortunately. But like I say, the first chapter of this absolutely blew me away, absolutely enthralled me. And I feel like I've got a few books here and there where like the first chapter has really grabbed me and then I've just been lost for the rest of the book and I've just not been engaged with it. I feel like that's definitely a video that I want to do because like I say, there have been like 4 or 5 books where the first chapter has been so strong for me and then I don't know what's happened. It's just all gone by the wayside for me. But I will say, if you have been interested at all in this book, definitely pick it up and see if it is for you. I think this is really a fantastic exploration of family and cruelty and obsession and truth and lies. I feel like the main character is fantastically dislikable. She comes so close at many points to kind of recognizing her major flaw and then will just completely skirt over it. This main character is a really fantastic study in how a lot of the time people will often only see what they want to see in other people. She is so obsessed with having control of the narrative of her life and having people see things the way that she sees them, that she doesn't always recognize the truth. For example, there is one section, I think it's in the second chapter, where she goes to visit her father to give him an update on how her mother is doing. And whilst he is talking to her, she is not really registering anything that he's saying, and she says, "I don't listen carefully to the details of what he says. I am used to compartmentalising him to these brief visits and relegating his face to a corner of my psyche." And I was saying to Kieran, I have never seen a character so early on in a book kind of recognise like a fatal flaw in their character and yet not recognise it as a flaw. She is so used to having this kind of character portrait of all of the people in her lives that she does not even allow herself the chance to pick up on nuances in their characters. Anything that does not reflect this perfectly curated image of these people in her life, she just kind of neglects and just glosses over. And it really makes you think about what is it that we ignore in the people who we love in our lives when we do not really recognise them for who they actually are, but rather how we want to cast them ourselves in our minds. She is so close to being self-aware and then completely misses it. It is a really interesting book and like I say, has such a strong beginning. However, the rest of it kind of got lost along the wayside for me. And finally, getting into the last 2 books that I read this month, of course it has been Victober this month, in which those who participate on BookTube vow to read as many Victorian classics as possible, and in my Victober video I had said that I was wanting to read Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. This story follows the main character of Molly Gibson, who lives with her widowed father. They have a really strong father-daughter bond, however, as she starts to grow up, her father starts to recognise how she really needs a maternal presence in her life and decides to remarry. And this book is really charting the way that the family dynamic really shifts when he introduces her new stepmother and stepsister. We also get to see the dynamics of this town that Molly and her father live in, as well as getting insight into another family in the neighbourhood, the Hamleys, who they are friends with, and particularly how Molly and her new stepsister Cynthia interact with the 2 sons of the Hamley family, Roger and Osborne. And yeah, I wasn't sure what I was going to make of this when I went into it, but I really enjoyed this. This is once again a slow-paced character-focused story, and most of it takes place, in fact I think all of it takes place within this one town. And I think what makes this book so strong is that emphasis that Elizabeth Gaskell puts into the character development. All of the characters within this book feel very fully formed and very real. I feel like especially with the stepmother and stepsister characters, it would have been very easy for Elizabeth Gaskell to have kind of made them like one-dimensional. At many points I was worried that the stepmother character in this was going to become kind of like the traditional vain, shallow stepmother. And in a lot of ways, she is. She is incredibly vain and shallow. She is probably the biggest gaslighter character that I have ever come across. However, she isn't evil. She's not despicable. She is insufferable, yes, but in a way that you've met characters like this before in your own life. And she can be kind when she wants to. However, she is very appearance focused, and she is very much focused on trying to make herself look good. She's very prone to being jealous when Molly or even her own daughter seem to outshine her. But once again, we've all met somebody like that, and we've all probably had that kind of feeling, that little streak of jealousy in our own lives. So even though she is awful and insufferable at points in this book, like, you can understand where it comes from, even if you don't like it. I really love the dynamic between the 2 stepsisters, Molly and Cynthia. They are 2 very different characters, but I love how they bounce off each other. And especially when we first meet Cynthia, we see how she often will not take her mother's shenanigans. She will often call her mother out on things that she is doing, and I thought that was glorious. Molly is quite a level-headed, quiet kind of character. She is described as being not like the most stunningly beautiful person in the world. She's kind of somebody that you would often ignore. However, she really comes into her own because she is honest and reliable, and people, even though they don't necessarily see her upon first glance, really come to depend upon her throughout the story. Whereas Cynthia is kind of like the dazzling, shiny disco ball. She is beautiful, she is charming, she is witty. So throughout the story we have instances of the 2 sisters meeting other people, and people are drawn to Cynthia, and Cynthia kind of loves the attention. Men kind of fall on their knees for Cynthia because she is so beautiful and charming. However, Cynthia is not always interested in the long-term relationships with any of these men, and I thought she was such an interesting character because she isn't a bad person. She does play with people's hearts because she likes the attention, and as she says throughout the book, she loves to be loved, but she cannot always give these men what they want. And it is so interesting to see because I've definitely met people like that in my own life. People who are naturally like beautiful and charming and flirty, who regardless of what their relationship status is, can't help but kind of be charming and flirty with whoever they meet because they kind of love the attention and they love to be loved. Once again, they are not bad people, but maybe need to be a little bit more self-aware of how they are coming across to people and how that can kind of hurt other people. And it's so heartbreaking throughout this book to see Molly, because she isn't naturally very beautiful and naturally charming. She is often kind of neglected when people first meet her, but because she is so reliable and constant, and when Molly loves somebody, she loves them deeply and faithfully. You see throughout the book how people start to recognise how fantastic she is, which as a fellow quiet person, I just kind of was like, yay! Now, something I need to flag up for you before you read this is that this was the last novel that Gaskell ever published. In fact, this was published serially before it was published a year after she died. And unfortunately, Gaskell never got to finish the story. In fact, she came so close. You can tell that maybe there was like one chapter left for her to write, but she never got to finish the story. And I knew this going in. I knew that this book was unfinished, but it still blindsided me because we were so tantalizingly close to the ending. You know what's going to happen, but You don't get it. I think I said on my little review of this on Goodreads, it's kind of like if you have ever seen the film Notting Hill. It's like if you got to the scene where William has pulled up at the Savoy Hotel, he is about to go into the press conference where Anna is and confront her, but then the film just cuts to black and you never get to see the ending. Like, you know what's gonna happen, but you want to see it. You know, you just want to see this ending take place. You want to see how Elizabeth Gaskell wrote the ending. And we'll never get to see it. However, thankfully, she had mentioned to other people how the ending was going to take place. So you do have a little afterword written by her editor, which does kind of fill you in on what was going to happen. But it's just not the same, man. And yeah, it was so good. It was so good. I would also say this reminded me quite a lot of Middlemarch when I read it. I think Middlemarch actually came after that, and you can definitely see some of the similarities. I wouldn't be surprised at all if somebody told me that George Eliot was highly inspired by Elizabeth Gaskell. But definitely bear that in mind going in. If you weren't a fan of Middlemarch, then maybe you might not like this. It is definitely slower paced, character focused, deeply character focused. And because I loved Wives and Daughters so much, I then decided that I wanted to go back to a book that I have said in the past that I found kind of meh, but I knew I wanted to give a second chance to, and that is North and South. I read this, I think, November, December of last year, and I could not get fully on board with it. I mentioned in my Victober video that I was recognising whilst reading this how great Elizabeth Gaskell is as a writer. However, I had a few bugbears with it. And if you have followed me on Twitter, you will have seen the journey that I went on with this reread, because I realised that I was wrong. Is that how you pronounce it? Is that it? Oh, that leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. Yeah, I realised that I was wrong about this book, and I was wrong on a specific detail that I mentioned in my Victober video, and I would like to thank everybody who loves North and South who did not point this out to me, because I think my little fragile ego would not have been able to have handled it. You guys know me so well. So, I mentioned in my Victober video that the big thing that I could not get over in this book is that we meet the main love interest, John Thornton, when he is beating up a worker at his factory. We later find out that he was beating the workman because he was smoking on the premises, and that would have endangered the lives of the factory workers. And technically that is meant to be a good thing. He is saving the lives of his workers. However, because this main character is introduced via violence, I was just like, nope, do not like this man. And despite the fact that he is fantastic throughout the rest of it, I was still like, but he beat people up though. However, I went back and re-listened to this on audiobook, and I got about 15 chapters in, like a good way through this book, and I realised that hasn't happened yet. That beating up scene, which I thought was the introduction, has not happened yet. Like, what's going on? And then I realised my mistake. And I realised that the first time that I read North and South, I read a few chapters of it, and then I proceeded to watch the BBC miniseries from 2004. And the beating up the worker scene is in the BBC miniseries, but it's not in this book. But because I kind of back to back was reading a section of this and watching an episode, I conflated the two in my mind and kind of super inserted the beating up scene into the book, but it's not there. So I have been hating a character because of a TV only scene that does not exist in this book. And I feel a bit silly because upon rereading this, I love this book and I love the character of John Thornton. He is a gem. And this is not me really wanting to like badmouth the BBC production or Richard Armitage who plays John Thornton, because actually John Thornton for the rest of the BBC miniseries is pretty true to book. But that one thing just stuck in my head and I could not let it go, and as it turns out, didn't actually happen in the book. But yeah, I went back and I reread this and I really, really loved it. It has become like one of my new favourite books. So North and South tells the story of Margaret Hale, who has spent most of her life living down in the south of England. She is originally from a little hamlet called Helston, but she has spent most of her life living with her cousin in London. However, once her cousin marries, she goes back to Helston, where she is informed by her father that they are going to have to leave their little vicarage that he's living in, because he no longer is going to be affiliated with the Church of England. And we follow them as they move up to the north of England to a fictional town called Milton, which is roughly based on and Manchester. And through this book, Margaret is confronted by the differences between the North and the South, particularly the effect of industrialisation on the North of England. And it's really a story about her coming to integrate into the town that she is living in and coming to appreciate the North and the differences between the North and South. Another critique that I'd had about this book the first time that I read it was that I didn't like how dismissive Margaret was of the North. And as a Northerner, I kind of felt a little bit affronted because I never felt like she truly came to love the North. However, on the second reread, I can definitely see the journey that she goes through. And yeah, it just landed a lot better for me this time. And of course, there is a romantic element of it, and my little heart, my little heart. The only thing that I would say about this book is that I feel like the ending wraps up a little bit too quickly. But I guess that is quite a positive thing to say about a book, is that it's just over too quickly and you want more. Though I will say it seems to be quite an unfortunate thing that Elizabeth Gaskell's novels never quite end the way that you want them to. However, that's kind of purely out of circumstance rather than her skill as a writer. So yeah, fine, I was wrong, you were right. It's really good. I think the other thing that was kind of holding me back from loving Elizabeth Gaskell, at least the first time around, was that I didn't love the way that Elizabeth Gaskell was introduced to me by other people. I'd often heard her name come up in conjunction with Jane Austen because there are a lot of different parallels between Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell. You can definitely see where she takes inspiration, particularly in her romantic plots. For example, North and South is very well known for being a little bit of a riff on Pride and Prejudice, whereas I would say that Wives and Daughters really does a bit of a riff on Mansfield Park. However, when people had referred to Elizabeth Gaskell in the past, a phrase that has stuck in my head and I hated when I heard it was that Elizabeth Gaskell was the thinking man's Jane Austen. And I was like, excuse me? Another one that I'd heard is that Elizabeth Gaskell was Jane Austen with more grit, because her books take place during the Industrial Revolution and she talks a lot about industry and particularly talks a lot about class. And I just don't like this assumption that more grit means worthier or more valuable. That because Jane Austen doesn't deal with industry that she is in some way frivolous. Her stories are different, they have different focuses, but that doesn't mean that they are lesser. I feel like it's another instance of how Jane Austen is often undervalued, that people do not think about her wit and humour and societal commentary, they just think of romance. And even saying that, there is nothing wrong with stories that focus on romance. I just don't like it. I don't like these kind of negative comparisons. I just think Jane Austen and Elizabeth Gaskell are very similar in many ways, but a lot of their focuses are a little bit different. And it's different, but it does not necessarily mean that one is superior to the other. I love both authors and I'm definitely wanting to get round to more Elizabeth Gaskell in the future. Rant over. Anyway, that is it. Those are all of the books that I've read in the first half of October. Do let me know what you have read. Are you reading anything for Victober? Do let me know. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you are having a fantastic, fantastic day and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks.